Not because there are no problems that you cannot solve within sectors and through vertical interventions, but simply because many of the most difficult challenges that we face really require knowledge and, I would say, wisdom from a variety of disciplines to be resolved. And the issue we are discussing today is one of them. The Club of Rome was most famous, I guess, for its report in 1972, Limits to Growth. But I would assure you that we continue to present new studies, new analysis. A couple of months ago, my friend Jürgen Randers, who was, by the way, one of the original authors of the Limits report, presented a book called 2052, going back 40 years in time and also trying to project the next 40 years. A must-read, I would like to say. My colleague Johan Rockström and myself, we are launching this book in a couple of weeks' time, Bankrupting Nature, where we deal with this very integrated agenda. And one of the main conclusions is that what the world really needs is not a climate agreement, it needs an agreement to deal with more sustainable development, where food production and food security would be one of the most important ones. We have listened to two very interesting speeches this afternoon, addressing many of the problems that we face in terms of food and food production. And let me just say that, adding to that, that I think we should be conscious of the fact that the landscape in which we are trying to deal with these problems is rapidly changing, primarily for one reason, and not only because economies are growing and populations are growing, but because energy and commodities, which fell in real price during the last 100 years, were incredibly cheap, not least fossil fuels. They are now starting to increase in price. And we see a very clear trend that for most commodities, including energy, we have an increase in price, which means that, in particular for developing countries who are trying to catch up, development will, of course, be more difficult. And it will affect food and food production because of the many inputs that are needed for food production. And one of the main conclusions that I draw is that unless we organize our economies in a more efficient way when it comes to using energy materials, the equation ahead of us is going to be increasingly difficult. And you may just ask yourself why China is investing hundreds of billions of dollars every year in Africa. It's precisely because to have access to energy and raw materials. So I believe a circular economy, where we really use resources in a more intelligent way, natural, renewable, as well as finite, is going to be an absolute must. And incidentally, China already has that theme, that concept embedded in its last 5-year plan. And the European Commission recently launched a very important document, a roadmap to a more resource-efficient Europe. But I'm afraid that the euro crisis and the financial crisis is overshadowing most of these issues. And instead of trying to integrate these issues, and they are interconnected, because the financial crisis will be even more difficult to solve if energy and raw material prices increase. So you should have an integrated, a systems approach to all this. Now we had some, as I said, very interesting remarks concerning the food and food production challenges. I think what the two gentlemen shared with us was the importance of research and technology and to focus very much on productivity. and I very much agree with that. I would add that if we look at the world at large, in particular including developing countries, as Franz Josef mentioned, we also have to realize that for a very large majority of those who are malnourished or on the verge of that, they belong to the small farmers of this world. And it will require very special efforts to assist them to make their productivity increase. So industrial production is very important, but we have to broaden the picture and realize that, that we need really to focus on these small farmers, both in terms of technology and knowledge transfer. And we need to recognize that we should support them in their multifunctional capacity. And also realize that agriculture in most of these countries is not only a question of food production, it's also a question of jobs and salaries. And we should also realize that for them, inputs being more expensive is going to be a real problem. On average, a farmer in Europe applies around 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare today. In Africa, it's on average 7 kilos. So that's where the real transformation must take place. So rural development is going to be enormously important. And I very much like Franz Josef's reference to India. It has been very little recognized in our part of the world, but as a matter of fact, there is a legislation being passed in the Indian Lok Sabha, where there is a right for every Indian citizen to have at least 100 days of paid work per year. Of course, it has not been implemented everywhere, but it's a signal to the system and starting to really help the poorest of the poor to accomplish or obtain the purchasing power which makes it possible to start to develop a base wherefrom you can have a sustainable living. Another, I think, very important issue to focus on is the need to understand that agriculture is also affecting the natural landscape, the natural systems. And what we should aim at, and I think that Europe can help a lot, is to help restore degraded lands and help reforest forest land that today is nude. And we have good examples in different parts of the world that this can be done. I have a close friend, a Chinese American, John D. Liu. He has been very instrumental in making films about this, showing how you could restore the Loess Plateau from being totally denuded and without any yields whatsoever to almost like a paradise a few years later. And he has identified many, many areas and regions in the world where this could be possible. Another issue we have to deal with very diligently is, of course, the tension between food and fuels. There is constantly new research reports coming to the table showing how difficult it is to assess the overall effects, and that the so-called indirect land use effects are very, very difficult. What happens if all of a sudden a large tract of vegetable oil goes from the food industry to fuel the cars? Where is that vegetable oil coming from in the next step? Is it new soy plantations in desert areas, in forest areas in Brazil, or may be in palm plantations in Indonesia? Those are issues which are very, very difficult to address, and where we have to have a policy in Europe so that we don't spoil markets and spoil opportunities in other parts of the world. Last but not the least, I think the price of food that was referred to is a very important matter. And also the whole issue of waste and diets. All these issues are interlinked. And if we could do something in this part of the world, not only to do away with some of our own wasteful lifestyles, but also help small farmers in developing countries to reduce the large losses because of poor storage facilities. That could, of course, be incredibly important. So, ladies and gentlemen, those were just a few issues in addition to those already mentioned. I think we have to see agriculture within the context of a framework for a more sustainable economy, where the way we use energy and materials in total is going to be increasingly important. And the way we manage the natural systems, including water, is going to be increasingly important. And I do believe, and we do believe on the Club of Rome, that the incentive system of the economy has to be reconsidered fundamentally. Because today we incentivize things very often that are not sustainable, that are rather harmful, and we should do the opposite. Now, let me, after those introductory comments, introduce the next speaker, Paolo De Castro, Chairman or President of the Agriculture Committee of the European Parliament. And Mr. De Castro has a very distinguished background, both in academia but also in politics. He has been minister in Mr. Prodi's governments, and he has held a number of key positions in the academic world. And after Paolo De Castro, we have Dr. Barbara Burlingame from the FAO, Principal Officer in the Nutrition and Consumer Protection Division, with a number of awards from academic institutions, and not least a recipient of the New Zealand Science and Technology Medal. Both these speakers have been given 15 minutes to share with us their thoughts. So please, Mr. De Castro. And once again, thank you very much for involving the Club of Rome in your efforts.